the big worry it should have now is about Miernerad and how many troops with the brigades in Miernerad, and making sure they are not cut off. And that means either kind of withdrawing some of them or trying to get this breakthrough to the north to cut off the final salients around the Dobropillia axis of advance to allow those Ukrainian troops in Miernerad to get supplies in.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Maxim Tucker, the Times' Ukraine correspondent, who's been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. Maxim, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, Maxim, you've been following the situation around Pokrovsk in Ukraine for some time, and you visited the front lines near there recently at Dobropillia. What's the situation now?
So the Russians have got into the city apparently in their hundreds, and there is quite fierce street fighting along all sectors. The Ukrainians there have described to me as something like a chaotic scene. They're not sure where the Russians have got to and how many there are. If they're there in force, they just keep encountering them. And we're having situations now where Ukrainian drone operators who are hunkered down in the city suddenly encounter Russian infantry and engaging them in firefights. So it's a really, really difficult situation for the Ukrainian defenders there. And of course, if the Russians succeed in taking over Pokrovsk and controlling it completely, they will cut off Ukrainian troops further east in the town of Miernerad, and there are several brigades defending that town.
And as you say, Ukraine has reported around 200 Russian soldiers are now inside Pokrovsk itself. How is the fighting, especially the use of drones, likely to change within the city itself? And is there much left of Pokrovsk, given Russia's use of artillery in their attacks?
Yeah, so even the last time I was in Pokrovsk several months ago, the city was being bombed relentlessly by Russian jets, and it was being steadily reduced to rubble then. I mean, there are still, it's a relatively large town, there are still buildings that not necessarily intact, but still standing. And one of the reasons it's useful for the Ukrainians and could be useful for the Russians is because it does offer some shelter from drone activity. Once you're inside, you're relatively safe, you can be hidden. And that's what the Russians have been using to infiltrate, to creep, go through buildings, stay hidden and stay away from the drones. It's harder for drones to fight inside cities. Of course, they are still trying. So this, gives way to a different kind of fighting. It's close quarters fighting, house to house, street to street, sometimes room to room fighting in these small areas. And that's very, very difficult if you're not able to get ammunition in very easily, which is the trouble for the Ukrainians now, because the Russians have been able to cut off logistics routes into Pokrovsk from the west. I mean, they might still be getting some from the northern side, but that's also increasingly difficult.
What is the situation if Pokrovsk is taken by the Russians? I mean, it is sometimes quite difficult to judge the strategic importance of specific towns in eastern Ukraine. Would it be a significant loss, and would Ukraine have to fall a long way back, or how worried are the Ukrainians about this?
Ukraine has used Pokrovsk. It's an important road hub. It's a crossroads. It connects lots of different towns in the Donbass area, and it also one of the last major towns before the main road into Pavlohrad and Dnipro, which is a big city in Ukraine of 1 million people. And Pavlohrad is also very, very important as a kind of chemical industrial town, which is really important to Ukraine's war effort. So losing Pokrovsk and also providing the Russians with a town where there's still cover to hide, where there's still cover and buildings to base units in, to put headquarters in, to dig into, that is very challenging for the Ukrainians. I think there's the difficulty they have now, and they're being urged by some commentators to withdraw from Pokrovsk, to pull troops back from Miernerad, is that because they've been having success in this Dobropillia sector to the north and the east of Pokrovsk, if they could clear the Russians some way from that area, then they would relieve some of the pressure on Pokrovsk and Miernerad. So Ukrainians seem to want to hold on to Pokrovsk in the hope that they can maybe open up a second logistics route from the north. But it does look very, very difficult indeed. And one of the challenges they're facing now is that you don't have to drive enemy infantry back a few kilometers to secure a road. You have to drive them back 20, 30 kilometers in order to secure it and to prevent drone operators getting access to your logistics line. And that's what's really, really challenging for the Ukrainian defenders in Pokrovsk.
And in Dobropillia, we saw Ukraine was able to bring in a reserve force in the form of the Azov Corps. Is there anything left like that Ukraine could deploy here within Pokrovsk itself that could help them kind of bring in fresh forces?
Well, Ukraine doesn't have very many reserves, and even in Azov, it was kind of different units that were patched together and put under the command of Azov. And it's not a real corps. Actually, it's still being formed, and they were just rushed into this situation to try and shore up the lines. And I think that demonstrates, although they had a good degree of success in Dobropillia, I think that demonstrates how stretched the Ukrainians are and how difficult it is for them to mobilize a significant reserve. And I think, it will be very, very difficult to pour troops into Pokrovsk, into the town, because of the problems with logistics lines. I mean, Ukraine may be better off trying to kind of clear the Russians from the logistics lines into Pokrovsk, but it would have to do that very quickly. And I think the big worry it should have now is about Mirnorad and how many troops with the brigades in Mirnorad, and making sure they are not cut off. And that means either kind of withdrawing some of them or trying to get this breakthrough to the north to cut off the final salients around the Dobropillia axis of advance, to allow those Ukrainian troops in Mirnorad to get supplies in.
And elsewhere in Ukraine, we've seen the Russian air bombardment campaign continue to intensify. Is there any solution in sight to the increasing ability of Russia to needle through a lot of Ukrainian air defences at the moment?
I think it's scaling up interceptor drones, but that requires money, and it's really difficult for Ukraine because they're having a difficult economic situation. They're not sure about their Western partners and the future of financial support, particularly from the US. And it's a real challenge for them to scale up production of the ingenious things that they've come up with. Of course, they do still need Patriot missiles, and to intercept ballistic missile threats, which Russia is increasingly using, different kinds of cruise missiles. And it just relies on the US for those. So that is becoming a really, really big problem for Ukraine.
And during the strikes on Kherson this week, a children's hospital has been hit. Are Russia increasingly targeting civilian facilities like this in an attempt to put pressure on Ukraine and its Western allies, for that matter, or is this just kind of standard tactics from the Russian army?
Well, we're seeing Russia bombing hospitals, children's hospitals, even, that is almost becoming sadly routine, and the kind of the Western outcry, the Western rage at such things is diminished because it's become so normal. It's the new normal. And I think that is one of the problems that Ukraine is struggling with after more than 3 years, coming up to 4 years of warfare, is that all of this has become so normalized and so routine that it doesn't stir the reaction that it might have once done in Western capitals, and provoke a response. And I think that is something that Ukraine needs to think about, or to figure out how it kind of shores up its allies, what it can offer in terms of its defense, what it can offer its own civilian population, with what it has, to protect its infrastructure against Russian strikes. There has been some Western support engineering solutions proposed to Ukraine for its energy infrastructure, and yet we're still seeing Ukraine suffering from blackouts and rolling electricity shortage because of these Russian strikes.
And we're not seeing any change in the determination on both sides of this conflict, are we? That being the morale of the Ukrainians to continue the defensive fight, but also the determination, seemingly, of the Kremlin to try and seize more Ukrainian land, are we?
Well, I think Putin sees that he's got an opportunity with Trump that's going to last as long as Trump's term, or as long as MAGA is in power, really. And he's going to keep pushing for his objective, which is to take over the whole of Ukraine. And the onus really is now on the Europeans to say, well, actually, we can't afford to have Russian troops with Ukrainian conscripts, which would be the result of a Russian victory in Ukraine, on the borders of Europe, on the borders of Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Like, this is going to be a huge problem for Europe if it doesn't stop the Russians in Ukraine. And that's something I think Europeans need to think long and hard about, and be matching the threat that is posed to them with increasing resources.
Hmm. And while they wait for those resources, Ukraine's own long-range strikes on Russia have continued, hitting the Mariinsky refinery and other energy infrastructure in Russia in recent days. How is that strike campaign progressing, do you think? And is there room for Ukraine to build on that and keep adding this economic pressure onto the Kremlin?
Well, they've shown that they can really scale up these long range strikes, the deep strikes as they call them. So many refineries have been hit, and now we've seen actually attacks on thermal energy plants, power plants. These are things that would actually be frowned upon. They're things that they should not really be doing in warfare. But after having been bombarded and had their energy infrastructure been attacked for so long and so many years, it seems like the Ukrainians are just prepared to take matters into their own hands. And one of the things is if they aren't getting Western support and the Western support they need, they're also not going to abide by any Western constraints on them. And I think what you're going to see is, it's still an existential war for the Ukrainians. They're still very, very determined to fight. They see that they don't have a choice. And the war is just going to become more savage as a result.
And we mentioned the coalition of the willing before, or Ukraine's European allies. They've promised further support for long-range strikes. Presumably, as other diplomatic avenues, don't come to fruition, Ukraine are going to increasingly be relying on their ability to strike into Russia, are they?
Well, I think that's what everyone is seeing, is that Putin is not prepared to come to the peace table. When he does talk about peace, it's not genuine. And he goes back to there will be peace, basically, if Ukraine capitulates and is not a sovereign nation anymore. And so that means that Ukraine has to find whatever ways it can to bring the war to Russia and to make it clear to Russians that they can't just stand by and allow this to happen to Ukraine. There will be consequences. And it's not just something that's targeting the leadership. And I think Ukraine is saying we want to see now Russians experience the same kind of difficulties that we've had, and that might get them to stop the war. We want to see Russians also suffering blackouts. We want to see Russians also freezing if we're freezing. So this is the way that I think this is how the future of the war is looking. It's going to be Ukraine trying to use long-range strike capabilities. It's going to see Ukraine developing these kind of missile capabilities, longer range, to try and inflict more pain on the Russian population. And it's going to be a pretty awful kind of war.
And we've heard Zelensky in this week and last week, and for some time for that matter, agreeing with the idea of a sort of immediate ceasefire or armistice and a stopping of the battle lines where they are in Ukraine. Is that something that, in your experience, you've seen accepted by troops on the ground? Is that something they believe they could hold to if an official ceasefire was put in place? Or is there still that worry that Russia would just bide its time and restart the war where it was convenient for them?
I think both things are true. I think they do see that, if there is a ceasefire, they expect the Russians to come back, but they also desperately need a breather. They really need a rest. And so the troops on the front line are very willing to kind of have a ceasefire for some time on the current front lines. And I think that would benefit Ukraine. It would be able to prepare, it would be able to use Western support, it would be able to rebuild some of its infrastructure during that time. It would be more beneficial to Ukraine, I think, than Russia. And that's exactly why Russia doesn't want to go along with the ceasefire. And I think Ukraine's calculation is, if we can see that Russia's economy is being destroyed, it's being damaged, that people are losing money, that people are starting to lose electricity, and then maybe they'll be more likely to accept a ceasefire along those terms. But it still looks very unlikely this winter, I would have thought.
So there's not a belief at the moment then that there's been enough damage to bring Russia to the table or to inspire that feeling in the Russian population that they want to put pressure on their leadership to bring the war to a stop.
No, I think Ukraine would need to have kind of really held the Russians, to stop, to have, Pokrovsk is on the brink of falling here, and that would be a victory that Putin would very much like to see and to sell to his own population. So as long as the Russians are going forward, as long as they're threatening important towns, they are going to continue, I'm afraid.
And in recent days, Trump has met Chinese leader Xi Jinping in South Korea. Is there any real prospect, do you think, of China working towards a ceasefire in Ukraine? I mean, it was something that was discussed, but didn't seem to amount to a huge amount at that meeting.
Well, I think China has a vested interest in keeping NATO occupied in Europe and preoccupied with what's happening in Ukraine so that there is not the same amount of focus on Taiwan. That said, obviously, Europe and the US do have leverage over China. They often forget it, that the trade volumes are huge. And I think if the US and Europe were able to drive a wedge between Russia and China, that would make a difference. That would change the calculus. So I think that the US is, it's actually right that Donald Trump is having these meetings with Xi, talking about some way to kind of build the relationship, but it has to be a carrot and stick diplomacy. There also has to be some, threats of sanctions and further actions if China does continue to support or increase support for Russia in the way that it has been doing to date.
And we speak about the stick element of this in the form of sanctions, I suppose, at the moment. We have seen some Chinese firms, after that new round of US sanctions, pulling back their contracts with Russian oil firms. Is there more, do you think, at the moment that the US or Europe could do to try and make China buy less Russian oil?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's important for sanctions to be put in place. But we've seen every time sanctions have been put in place that intermediary companies operate, they start opening, they start finding ways round sanctions. And all of the sanctions have had some companies start up and start bypassing them, routing them through third countries, things like this, ways to get through sanctions. And what hasn't happened really is, given the scale of this problem, is the law enforcement agencies to be resourced properly. That's in the US and in Europe, to tackle people that violate sanctions, to bring enough prosecutions. Sanctions work for the scrupulous businesses that are worried about their reputation internationally, but for the unscrupulous businesses that just serve a purpose of bypassing these sanctions, they don't really work. And what Trump has done in the US has really been to hollow out the FBI to such an extraordinary degree that it is not really capable right now of engaging in that law enforcement activity. And I think that's something that Europe needs to step up to as well when it's thinking about enforcing its own sanctions.
Yeah, and Zelensky has called on the West to go further on sanctions. Outside of China, what more could be done now, and what could we realistically expect Europe or the US to do to bring more economic pressure to bear?
Well, Russia's shadow fleet is still operating uncontested. I mean, there's all these difficulties with international law of stopping vessels and boarding them and turning them around or seizing them. But that's something that Russia counts on. It wages an asymmetrical war in this. It doesn't care about law. It doesn't care about international law, any kind of democratic norms. And of course, we need to abide by those. But we can also find creative ways to stop things that are clearly wrong. I think law is supposed to operate with a principle of natural justice. And if something is happening that is clearly unjust, Russia is being able to sell this oil using very dangerous fleet tankers that, they pose a real risk. Some of these they're aging, they're decrepit, they leak, they could break down, and they're going through, different international waterways near European countries on a regular basis. So maybe there's a way to look at that problem and think about how can we stop these boats, how can we stop these ships, turn them around, and arrest some altogether.
And we've also seen this week the EU again not able to agree how they could utilize Russian frozen assets. Is there a worry about where the support is going to come from for Ukraine going into winter?
I think it's really difficult for the Ukrainians to tell, because whenever they speak to the Europeans, they're getting very warm messages and kind of reassuring noises from Europe. And at the same time, they of course they are still getting funds, and they are still getting weapons. They are still getting promises, and some significant promises that will make a difference over time. For example, Sweden promising 150 Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine over the next kind of 10 to 15 years. Those are hugely important things, but they can't just be symbolic. They have to be met, not just the future, but what is going to happen now. And I think, Zelensky will still be pushing for Europe to come up with a solution. How is Ukraine going to fund its budget? I mean, Ukraine is effectively paying for the defense of Europe itself here. So why aren't Europeans contributing more to supporting Ukrainian budget?
And is there a worry as well in Ukraine that Europe doesn't really realise the wider threat to the continent from Russia outside of the war on the ground?
I think there's a kind of a disconnect here where increasingly European leaders with access to intelligence, with access to information about the plots that Russia has orchestrated on European soil, arson attacks against the Starmer family, or kind of attacks on ammunition depots and military equipment across Europe. Um, Leaders, I think, do on the whole realize the threat that Russia poses, and in fact that Russia is already waging hybrid war on Europe and the UK as well. I think the problem is that a lot of European populations and societies don't necessarily see it that way. And one of the problems I think you're noticing more and more is that there were all these platforms in the US that were dedicated to fighting disinformation, a lot of them funded by US aid or other kind of governmental programs. And they've all just gone away. And you can see how many Russian disinformation posts come after every kind of reputable media article posted on social media. They don't seem to be being policed in the same way that they were before. And Russia is obviously only escalating its disinformation tactics. So European populations are distracted. They're thinking about other things. They don't realize quite the level of existential threat that Russia could pose if it came to European borders. And I think European leaders need to find a way to tackle both disinformation and persuading their own populace that this is important, this is worth making sacrifices for.
And Maxim, you are heading back out to Ukraine again soon. What are you expecting to find, and what will you be looking into?
We'll be looking at, exactly that question of how long can Ukraine survive? Zelensky has talked about being able to fight for 2 or 3 years more. Is that realistic? Can they see out the Trump administration and hope for something better? Who is going to be coming to Ukraine's rescue in that period? What kind of economic support have they got? What kind of domestic economic power have they got? How are they planning for these next few years? I think that's what I'm going to be looking at in the next trip.
Well, Maxim, it's always great to speak to you, and our audience can find a link to all of your articles and work for the Times in the description below. Maxim Tucker, the Times' Ukraine correspondent, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thanks, Louis.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.